the beef industry, as well as sheep and goats. Most of this lecture focuses on beef industry because beef are a really important commodity. If you think about hamburgers and ground beef and steak, all of that is beef. So we're going to first compare dairy cattle and beef cattle. So beef cattle are generally more stocky. They are generally made up of the Angus breed. They're fed grain to make them grow a lot faster. All of the animals are used to produce meat. So I'm saying that like males, females, and young. So when we look at dairy cattle, the only thing that they're using is females. They're only kept until they're mature, which is about 18 to 24 months, and they are kept on what's called feedlots. So dairy cattle are generally thin and lean. The breed that we use is primarily Holsteins, the black and white ones, and they're used to produce milk. So because of that, we only usually keep females. They're kept longer. They're usually kept for about 6 years, which is when their milk production is the highest. They have to be supplemented with calcium. A lot of these cows are more likely to be fed grass, and unlike beef cattle, they are sometimes put into stalls for milking. So they don't live in the stalls, but they do use them for milking, and they don't do that for beef cattle. They don't really put them in stalls. So the two things that are most similar between them is they're obviously both ruminants, and because of that, they do best on grass. Like their bodies are made to eat grass, essentially. So this is a picture of a feedlot. You might not have ever seen one before because they generally don't exist near population centers because they are very smelly. But it's essentially a plot of cleared land. It's usually dirt because they trample out the grass and eat it. They've already eaten all of it, like before, when they first started this farm. And this is where we generally see beef cattle. Dairy cattle are not kept on feedlots. This is just an example of how they can be milked. So this is actually like a circular milking belt, and it slowly turns, and they've basically got it timed perfectly where the cow steps on and is milked all the way around the circle, and by the time it gets back to the circle, it steps off, and that's how long it takes to milk them. So they don't live in this stall, but you don't see anything like this on on a beef farm. So, beef cattle is the single largest money generating commodity in all of agriculture. And about 6% of the world's, we in America have about 6% of all the world's cattle and 18% of meat from cattle. And the United States is the biggest beef producer and consumer in America right now. So, the purpose of the beef cattle industry is to take something that we can't use, such as grass, and make it usable. And in this case, it's meat. All of the industries that we see are taking something that's not as valuable and turning it into something more valuable. And in this case of beef, it's creating the meat or the beef. 60% of all of our agriculture land is actually used for grazing cattle, and these are showing where the cattle is most concentrated, particularly in this Midwest area, and even some of the, technically, I think Kentucky is considered Midwest too. But this is the places that we see. And you can see Wisconsin's kind of an odd one out. And if you remember, this isn't just beef cattle. It's also like dairy cattle. So Wisconsin makes a lot of cheese. So we've talked about in other industries how there's different kinds of like production places with pigs, I think. And we have something similar with the market for the beef industry. So we have really, really specialized farms that can be owned by the same company. And the reason for that is because they specialize in one specific aspect. So, for example, a seed stock farm is literally just trying to make the best breeding cows. So they're not necessarily making a bunch of beef cattle. They're trying to like get the best male and then the best female. Cow calf producers are essentially like birthing the cattle, and they only keep them to be about 6 to 10 months old. So they are raising babies essentially. Yearling slash stock operators are not always 100% needed. They're kind of like growing out the cow after they're done like being a baby. So it not always necessary, and just kind of depending on the industry, but that's what a yearling slash stocker operator are. And then the feedlot is the finishing phase. So this is only for about 120 to 150 days of their life, and it's like their final days where they're essentially like fattened up and finished by getting them really like muscly and they have good meat quality. So that's what we call the feedlot phase, is their last days of their life, essentially getting fattened up for slaughter. So, genetics of beef cattle is extremely difficult to track, and there's people who are paid millions of dollars who are trying to get the best cows. However, not all the traits are really connected, and sometimes one trait can like negatively impact another trait. So, these are just some of the traits that people breed for or are trying to look for. Calving interval, which is how long they have to actually drink milk, birth weight, weaning weight, which is when they can be taken from their mothers, a cow's maternal abilities, such as like giving milk and nourishing the baby, feedlot gain, efficiency of gain, so like how quickly are they gaining versus like how much do they gain. And then we do have some important carcass or meat qualities. So in general, we usually call meat carcasses before they've been processed. And these are three things that we look for, especially with beef. So we look for carcass grade, which is how much fat is on the meat. Generally, it kind of depends on the cut, but like if you think about ground beef, like the leaner meat is usually more expensive. Ribeye area is particularly a muscle called the longissimus dorsi, which is on your back or the cow's back, and they're measuring the length of it. And then tenderness. So tenderness comes from how much fat is like integrated into the muscle. We really like tender meat. So all of those things are things that they're even trying to breed for because they obviously like want to be able to sell high quality meat. So these are some of the cuts of meat, and this picture is showing inexpensive, moderate, and expensive cuts. So you can see here that our ribs is more expensive, the short loin. Places like the neck and the back are usually not as expensive. The middle is a little bit more expensive. So what do you think determines the cost of meat? There's a few things that determine the cost of meat, and this is in your notes, or you should write this in your notes. So how much is it available on the cow? So usually the pieces of meat that are not as abundant on the cow are going to be more expensive. Another thing is like how accessible it is to get to the meat. So like availability, like how difficult is it to get to it when we're butchering the cow? And of course, tenderness and flavor. So the places like ribs and short loin tend to be more tender and have more flavor and marbling of fat, and all of those things are things that we look for in a good quality cut of meat. So not all pieces of meat are the same. You might have seen like, skirt steak versus like a sirloin steak are two very different prices, right? And that's because the skirt steak comes from down here. We have, like much more available, whereas the short loin, and this picture doesn't show it as well. The short loin's a pretty small area on the cow, and it's more tender. So one sad question that you might not have thought of is what happens to male dairy cows? So we talked about how dairy cows only use females, but they have to be constantly giving birth. So it is a little sad, but all male dairy cows, if they aren't going to be used for breeding, which most of them do not, they are what becomes veal. So I feel like it's important to tell you that because I think it's important to know like where your food comes from. And not all markets like want the general public to necessarily, they're not going to advertise like, oh, veal's baby cow, right? So that sounds really terrible and sad. And I have an article linked here about that actual aspect on The Guardian. And it's an article that talks about the end of dairy's dirty secret. So in the UK, they have banned the killing of male dairy cows, and they have to figure out what to do with them because people think it's a little unsavory and very sad that they kill cows for veal. Now you might be wondering like, why is there a specific cut of meat that's specifically this type of meat? It's because they're young and their meat is very tender. So that is what veal is. So feeding beef cattle is really important because the type of food that they're eating is going to determine if their like meat is very tender, as well as like if they have a lot of meat on them. So as I said, they're usually given forages like hay until they go to the finishing stage. So the last 120 to 150 days of their life, they're given a very high quality feed to try to fatten them up, without sacrificing the quality of meat. So it's like a very delicate balance on, like how much they should be fed to not like get too much fat on the meat. So, one topic that I think is really controversial right now is grass fed beef. So, anytime you go to the grocery store or restaurant, they will advertise, some companies advertise that their cows are grass fed. And the reason why I put that in quotes is because the principle of grass fed is that they're never fed corn and they're instead fed a more natural diet, which is grass or high quality forage. And a lot of these animals, it's interpreted that they're able to graze on the grass. But I will say that grass fed does not necessarily mean that a cow has been eating grass their entire life. That would be called grass finished. So animals that are grass fed are fed are fed grass until they go to the feedlot stage, whereas maybe a normal cow would be not necessarily like grazing on grass. So, I mean, there is a difference, but if you're looking for a cow that's been eating an entirely natural diet its whole life, you need to look for grass finished and not grass fed. Grass finished means they eat their grass like their entire life, whereas grass fed means that they are still fed corn and a high quality ration feed at the end of their life. So, some people claim that grass fed is better for you. That is somewhat true because the meat is a little bit leaner and there are trace amounts of more minerals and antioxidants in grass-fed beef. But if you're doing it more for an ethical standpoint, you really need to look at the companies that you are supporting, because if you are wanting to support a company that allows animals to graze on grass their entire life, you need to look more into grass finished and not just grass fed. So this is an article that's on the Business Insider about if you should buy grass-fed beef. And it says if the label says grass-fed, it's usually more expensive, but the designation may mean absolutely nothing. All cows eat grass after all. It's what they do and what they have done for centuries. So for this reason, the industry experts have said for years that the term is cryptic and possibly deceitful. With other ambiguous meat and dairy claims such as natural free range, the grass-fed claim isn't tightly regulated by the government. So the Agricultural Marketing Services announced it was dropping its official definition of grass-fed. So before this time, there wasn't really like a good definition for it. So now companies are going to have to be a little bit more serious when they are labeling it. And this was from 2016, so it's not super recent, but you really, it's kind of just like a cautionary tale that you can't just like look at the labeling and think that they're always being truthful. There sometimes is some not necessarily deception, but you really have to look into what you're buying, and even though it might be more expensive doesn't necessarily mean it might be better for you or the animal unless you do your research. So an interesting question you might not have ever thought of is, why do we actually eat beef? Like, why do we consume cows? So with any animal that we eat, we're definitely going to do it for the protein content. So we do need a lot of protein in our diet, and beef is very concentrated in protein. I think a lot of us just enjoy the taste of beef, like ground beef in a taco, a hamburger. It's more of like just people enjoy the flavor of it. And sometimes beef can definitely be a sign of wealth. If you think of like going to a steakhouse, like Ruth's Chris or something like that, you're going to get a nice dinner like with a steak, right? I don't really feel like, a lot of people when they say they want to go to a fancy dinner, they're expecting like a steak or a lobster or something like that. So it is more somewhat of a sign of wealth in our society as well. This is just a link showing the nutrients that are available in beef. If you're curious to know like how quality the nutrients are. Now you do need to be aware that it comes from the Beef Cattle Research Council, and the Beef Cattle Research Council, of course, is going to be supporting beef cattle production. So of course they're going to say that beef has a lot of nutrients, like vitamin B12, like it can help with that. So you always got to take it with a grain of salt with where you're getting the source from. So the next thing is some trends in the beef industry. So here is a graph that shows meat consumption by selected country. And we can see here that the United States is at the top, and we've always been the highest consumer, but we have actually taken a steady decline, which is one thing we talked about with the chicken industry, right? Like we've said, chicken is now like our main our main protein. You can also see that countries like China and Brazil, which are more developing countries and not necessarily fully developed countries, are having a rapid increase in meat production in general. So, these are some trends that we can take away from this graph. Beef consumption is decreasing in America and increasing in most developing countries. Another thing that you can also say is America is the number one consumer of beef right now. So those are the three things that you can take away from this graph. So I'll give you a minute to like pause the video so you can write this down. So here's our next graph. It says estimated average US consumption compared to recommendations 1970 and 2017. So as you can see, the recommended dietary recommendation is this black line. And we've always been above the average or like above what the guidelines say for meat, eggs, and nuts. And we used to not be above the one for grains, but now we are. We're eating a lot more grains, and we're not meeting the vegetables, dairy, and fruit guidelines. So, in general, Americans tend to overeat meat. We actually don't need to like eat as much protein as we eat, but that kind of leads me to the point that meat is a sign of wealth and like a sign of thriving, right? So I mentioned that when you're thinking about steak, and meat has always just been a sign of like, you know, like it was something that was conserved and not eaten as much. And as America has gotten more wealthy, we've decided that like we want to eat meat at every meal because it makes us feel full and get a lot of nutrients out of it. So we do tend to overeat our meat, and one reason might be because it is a sign of wealth, whether that's like conscious or unconscious. So here's just another graph showing and I think I might have shown this one before, because you can see the chicken is increasing, and we've already talked about that before, and the beef was increasing and then now is decreasing. So that's just something we already mentioned, how our beef consumption is decreasing over time. It was rapidly increasing, but we now have focused more on chicken. So food safety is a huge issue when it comes to beef. But I think it's more of a perception issue than anything. America is one of the safest in the world and has the strictest regulations when it comes to our meat consumption. But again, the perception of safety is a huge issue when it comes to meat. So we are going to talk about diseases in beef next class, and how these diseases have impacted our society. So, these are just a few things that people are aware of and may have kind of like be weary of the beef industry because of these things. So, for example, meat slash milk additives. So, when we talked about hormones in milk, that's kind of what I mean by that. Like, people think that there are hormones in meat as well, which is not true. We will talk about antibiotic use, foodborne pathogens, and mad cow disease as well when we talk about diseases next class. So, all of these things have created a negative perception of beef and might have actually like contributed to the decline in beef in general, which we will talk about. Um, yeah, our eating of beef has declined for a number of reasons. When we talked about chicken, it's just like fast food and it's cheaper, there's a longer shelf life. One thing that we haven't mentioned yet is because people for a long time perceived beef as being not as safe when we'll talk about mad cow disease and things like E. coli. So the perception of safety in beef is like a really serious issue that the USDA has to constantly work to get people to believe in beef and think that it's safe. So our last section of industries is for sheep and goats, which is really short. Sheep and goats generally have a really small market, and there's really not as big of an industry as compared to pork. I don't know why it specifically just says pork. I mean, it's like all industries, it's super small. So here is what our meat production looks like. So pork and beef are almost like tied actually, and chicken like is almost half of our production, whereas turkey is about 5.9 billion, and then veal and lamb and mutton together make about 150 million. So like exponentially, we're producing exponentially more beef, pork, and chicken, but there's a pretty small market for lamb and mutton. In other countries, lamb and sheep are, or I should say, lamb and mutton are much more common, especially because there's not like factory farming and it's easier to like raise a goat or a sheep for meat because they're smaller. But in America, we just haven't really had that big of a market for it. So we'll talk about sheep first. So the sheep industry is not very large. As I've mentioned before, sheep really need to be in big herds because they're very skittish, and they can be raised for three different things: meat, which can be called mutton; milk, which is sheep's milk, which I've never heard of anyone drinking that. I don't even know like what the market is for that. And then fiber or wool. I would say like the two big ones are definitely meat and fiber. So almost all of the income comes from shearing sheep. So shearing sheep is the process of getting their wool or their fiber. And this is like a really renewable industry because you don't have to keep raising new sheep to get wool, which is really cool. China has the largest production of sheep. And at the end of the day, it's a pretty small industry. So, especially in America. So they do have sheep that are raised more like in places in Europe. So this is a picture of them relocating a flock of sheep, and this is like the little herding dog right there during a bad weather storm. So one question that I definitely want you to write down is shearing sheep is not does not hurt the sheep in any way. I think there's sometimes a misconception that like shearing the sheep is like taking off their skin, which is just not true. We have selectively bred sheep to have very, very long coats that do not fall off on their own. If a sheep was in the wild, their coat, like not this type of sheep, like I mean like a wild sheep, their coat like can fall off on their own, but we have to shear them. So shearing them is essentially just like cutting their hair. They actually have like sheep shearing competitions because there's a very particular way to shear a sheep in order to get all of the like the wool off at once, and they have competitions to see who can do it the fastest. So sheep don't like being separated from their herd, so they are going to get a little stressed when they're being sheared, but at the end of the day, shearing a sheep doesn't hurt them. They do it during the summertime, which is when they want to be cool anyway, so it's not hurting them. So here's a funny picture of sheep before and after being sheared. So they look very naked, and yeah, it doesn't hurt them at all. So as I said, they can't their wool doesn't fall off, and this is just like a funny story about a sheep who escaped shearing for 6 years. So he basically like lived in like outside of the enclosure, and they kept trying to find him, but he like got lost essentially, and they actually found him 6 years later, and this is what he looked like. So this is like they don't lose their wool every year because that's how we've bred them to do. So it says that his fleece weighed about 27 kilograms, about six times the average fleece produced, which makes sense because like he was around for 6 years, and his fleece contained enough wool to make suits for 20 large men. So he actually became pretty famous. Like this is what he looked like here. So he had a lot of fur on it, a lot of wool on him, I should say. And they actually like auctioned off his fleece for charity because he became so famous. So this was him in like his little coat once he had gotten sheared, and this is him with his coat. So yeah, it's a pretty good story. He lived to be 16, so he lived a good long sheep life, but he became famous because he looked so silly with his wool. So another thing that you might not like remember, but we used wool to make thread at one point, and this was just like a picture of them like making thread out of wool. So that was like a pretty important part of agriculture history when we started to make thread to make better clothes and things like that. But there are still people who do this by hand to make wool yarn. So the last part is the goat industry. So the goat industry, goats, as we mentioned, are a little bit more intelligent and social. And again, they have very, very small farms, and they're used for the milk or meat, depending on their breed. So we don't like see their wool or like their hair being used for anything. China also produces the most goats too, and it is a small industry, but they have something called the American Goat Federation, which kind of is an organization to help people like who have goat farms. They are people who like advocate for like goat farmers and agriculture in general. But yeah, like there's people out there who raise goats for a living. So this is a picture of what it looks like. You can see it's like not as high tech when it comes to milking them. It's just not as big of an industry, but we still do have a pretty big market for like goat cheese and things like that. It's like more selective though. So we still do have like a goat market. I would say most of it probably is coming from their cheese and their milk. And then this is just a cute picture of some goats on a farm. So, um, you know, people can make a living out of it, but it is still a pretty small industry in general. So that's all the notes for the beef, goat, and sheep industries. I appreciate you paying attention, filling in your notes. I think there's an exit ticket for today. Yeah, so make sure you do the exit ticket just so you can see like some application questions because we will eventually have a test on like with this material on it. So yeah. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm at a conference right now, so I appreciate you like, letting me go to this conference because I always learn like a lot of good stuff at these conferences. But if you have a question, just let me know and I will email you, right away as I, will be on my computer working while I'm in sessions and things like that. So have a great day.